and other employers who could use brawny workers who could not speak English were hiring illegal aliens. And the shock surely extended to the prosecutors in Iowa, all of whom, after all, are honorable men. The federal affidavit was a virtual cesspool of malicious, unfounded rumors, including the false allegation that there was a laboratory for producing narcotics, a narcotic I can barely pronounce, methamphetamine, was located at the plant, and that some employees carried weapons that were traded for drugs or sold. The federal prosecutors then armed 600 men, 50% more than Esav inducted to meet Yaakov, to raid agri-processors and to haul away any illegal aliens on the premises. Even a Black Hawk helicopter was requisitioned for this quasi-military assault. Sholem Rubashkin saw that a raid was imminent, and at the suggestion of the American Meat Institute, he hired a lawyer with Baker & McKenzie, one of the world's largest law firms who had represented Swift & Company, America's largest meat packer, when it, Swift, was threatened with a similar raid on a plant in Texas. The lawyer had negotiated with federal prosecutors in Texas that instead of besieging the meatpacking plant with a brigade of armed troops, the immigration officials should be granted peaceful access to the plant and to its employment records. They were then able to arrest illegal aliens employed at the plant. Please do the same for agri-processors, which is the nation's leading kosher meatpacking plant, as you did for Swift, said lawyer Robert Kent in a letter which he delivered to the federal prosecutors on May 9, 2008. And, he added, if you like, check with the prosecutors in Texas about me and my experience. The federal prosecutors in Iowa promptly rejected that sensible and peaceful request, and they invaded agri-processors on Black Monday, May 12, 2008. That assault not only did enormous physical damage, but it led directly to the bankruptcy of the business. The plant closed for a while, the cash flow dried up, and customers chose not to pay. Now, could the prosecutors, who are, of course, honorable men, have been seeking national publicity when they insisted on raiding agri-processors rather than finding illegal alien employees in a more civilized procedure? Did they possibly anticipate that the New York Times would carry a story on the front page of its national report section in which it said, quote, in the biggest workplace immigration raid this year, federal agents swept into a kosher meat plant on Monday in Postal, Iowa, and arrested more than 300 workers? Could they have anticipated that the incendiary affidavit which they disclosed would be repeated in the Times, and that the story regarding the methamphetamine lab and the trade in guns would be printed in the Times? Well, a sub-headline in the Times read, in Iowa, agents raid the largest kosher packing house. Now, the federal prosecutors would deny that they were seeking publicity by raiding America's largest kosher packing house. And, of course, the federal prosecutors are honorable men. The prosecutors took their time in bringing charges against Sholem Rubashkin. He hired lawyers. He remained in Postville, determined to prove to a fairly selected, impartial American jury that he was not guilty of knowingly hiring illegal aliens, and that agri-processors had screened applicants and turned away those that could not document that they were in the United States legally. Indeed, the very same affidavit that was chock full of slanderous false statements and that quoted the forward stories had to admit that an informant whom the Immigration Service tried to place at the Postville plant was rejected not once but twice because he had inadequate documentation of permanent residence. Only when the Immigration Service gave him on his third try authentic documents was he finally hired at agri-processors. Now, while many of America's Jews stood by and remained silent after the raid on agri-processors, some seized the opportunity to prove how virtuous they were. The New York Times lead editorial of August 1, 2008, repeated false allegations of, quote, a host of abusive practices, of rampant injuries, and of exhausted children as young as 13 wielding knives on the killing floor. And this was followed with an op-ed by an ambitious Washington Orthodox rabbi who questioned whether the food processed in the plant qualified as kosher and called for expressions of shame and embarrassment about the reports coming out of Iowa. The drive for a conservative hechsher turning on employee practices even began to draw Orthodox support. And at this point in time, a senator and presidential candidate named Barack Obama swung through Iowa on a campaign trip. He was asked about the now infamous kosher slaughtering plant, and he replied, "They have kids in there wielding buzzsaws and cleavers. It's ridiculous. And the only reason they're hiring these folks is because they want to avoid paying people decent wages and providing them decent benefits." What did the man who is now president know then about practices in the Postville plant? Absolutely nothing. But he was ready to condemn in the most severe terms. I told reporters who called me at the time that I was shocked, really shocked, that a professor of constitutional law was ready to render a verdict of guilty before examining the evidence. Lewis Carroll, the author of Alice in Wonderland, had his crazy Queen of Hearts demanding sentence first, verdict afterwards. And here was an American presidential candidate doing the same. What of Sholem Rubashkin's Shem Tov? Shlomo HaMelech says it's better than Shemen Tov, good oil. Well, looking at today's headlines, the president seems unable to turn bad oil into good oil. As a first step, he might consider restoring a Shem Tov by apologizing to Sholem Rubashkin, who was recently acquitted by a jury of knowingly hiring minors and disproved the statement that candidate Obama made. This might even be a useful step in restoring Shemen Tov. But let us return to the legal horror that was the Rubashkin prosecution. I have been through dozens of federal white-collar criminal investigations, and I routinely tell prosecutors that if they decide to charge my clients with crimes, the clients will surrender voluntarily, and they will plead not guilty to the formal charge. Never, I repeat, never has a prosecutor with whom I have discussed possible criminal charges arrested my client rather than permitting him to surrender voluntarily. For almost 6 months after he was officially told that he was a target of a federal criminal investigation, Sholem Rubashkin stayed in Postville, leaving the United States only for a Bikur Cholim trip to Canada and returning promptly. Instead of telling his lawyers that they wanted to charge him with a federal immigration law violation, as prosecutors routinely do in such investigations, Iowa's federal prosecutors